The cold up on Black Pine Ridge doesn't bite, it chews. It's a slow, wet gnawing that starts in your toes and works its way up to the marrow of your femurs until you forget what heat ever felt like. I should have known better than to come up here in late November, but the probate lawyers in Lexington were breathing down my neck, and Uncle Silas had left a mess that wasn't going to clean itself. Silas was the kind of man who didn't just burn bridges. He dismantled them plank by plank and used the wood to board up his windows. He died of a massive coronary 2 weeks prior, slumped over his kitchen table, alone. By the time the sheriff found him, the local fauna had already started making inquiries into his soft tissue. I was the only kin left, which meant the cabin, the 40 acres of vertical limestone and scrub oak, and the silence were all mine. The cabin sat at the bottom of a bowl-shaped hollow, right on the jagged stitch line where Kentucky bleeds into Virginia. It was a sagging, heavy-timbered thing, smelling of wet wool, stale tobacco, and the unique sweet rot of old paper. To get to it, you had to drive 3 miles up a gravel track that destroyed suspensions, then hike the last 100 yards down a footpath that was essentially a deer trail. I arrived on a Tuesday. The sky was the color of a bruised plum, heavy and low. The forecast called for a wintry mix, which is weatherman speak for "you're going to be trapped." I parked my Tacoma at the top of the ridge, grabbed my duffel and the box of contractor bags, and slid down the trail. The isolation hit me the moment I stepped onto the porch. It wasn't peaceful, it was oppressive. The silence here had weight. It pressed against your eardrums. The only sound was the wind hissing through the needles of the pitch pines and the groan of the cabin settling into the mud. Inside, it was a tomb. Silas had lived like a man expecting a siege. Canned goods were stacked floor to ceiling in the pantry. The windows were covered with heavy canvas tarps. The wood stove in the center of the main room was cold, a heap of gray ash spilling out of its iron maw. I spent the first 2 days just trying to make the place habitable. I cleared out the perishables, milk that had turned into a solid yellow puck, bread that was more mold than wheat. I scrubbed the floor where he died, using bleach until my eyes watered, trying to erase the stain that looked disturbingly like a shadow burned into the wood. By the afternoon of the 3rd day, the snow started. It wasn't a gentle dusting, it was a curtain dropping. Big, wet flakes that stuck to everything. The world turned monochrome. The trees became black skeletons against a white void. I was burning Silas's old newspapers in the stove to get the draft going. I felt watched. It's a cliché, I know, the city boy in the woods feeling the eyes of nature, but this was different. This felt predatory. It was a prickling at the base of my neck, a biological alarm ringing in the lizard part of my brain that predates language. I walked to the front window and peeled back the corner of the canvas. The snow was coming down harder now, blurring the edges of the world. The tree line was about 50 yards out, a dark wall of dense brush. That's when the uneasiness solidified into nausea. The woods didn't look right. The shadows between the trees seemed too thick, too vertical. I told myself it was just the isolation. I told myself I was tired. I let the canvas drop and went back to the fire. But the cold inside the cabin had changed. It wasn't just the weather anymore. It was the temperature of a room when you realize you aren't alone.
The first sighting happened on Thursday morning. I had filled 3 heavy-duty trash bags with Silas's refuse, mostly empty whiskey bottles, old magazines, and tins of snuff. The plan was to haul them up to the roadside bin the county laid out for the remote residents, a rusted metal dumpster situated about half a mile up the track. but with the snow now 6 inches deep and climbing, I decided to just stage them at the edge of the clearing for now, near the old incinerator drum. I wrestled the door open. The air tasted like iron. The silence was absolute. No birds, no wind, just the muffled stillness of deep snow. I trudged out, my boots crunching loudly. The sound seemed violently loud, a desecration of the quiet. I tossed the bags near the drum and wiped my gloved hands on my jeans. I turned to head back inside, and my eyes swept the perimeter. I stopped, my breath hitched in my throat, freezing into a white cloud. At the tree line, exactly where the dense rhododendrons gave way to the yard, someone was standing. It was about 30 yards away. He wasn't hiding. He wasn't behind a tree. He was standing in the open, framed by the dark boughs of a hemlock. He wore a coat that was a drab, undefined gray, the color of wet dryer lint. His jeans were frayed at the cuffs, dragging in the snow. He had no hat, no gloves, no scarf. It was 10 degrees outside. "Hey!" I yelled. The word sounded flat, swallowed instantly by the snow. "Can I help you?" Nothing. The figure didn't flinch. He didn't shift his weight. His arms hung limp at his sides, dead straight, like mannequins' arms before they're posed. He was facing me, but the distance and the falling snow blurred his features. All I could see was a pale patch where a face should be. My first instinct wasn't fear, it was confusion, followed by a spike of aggression. We were miles from the nearest town. This was private property. I said, "Can I help you?" I shouted again, stepping forward. The figure remained absolute stone. He didn't shiver. He didn't react to the cold or my voice. He just stood there, planted in the drifts. A sudden, irrational thought struck me. He looks like he's waiting for a bus. The posture was so casual, so devoid of tension, that it was terrifying. A man freezing to death curls in on himself. A man trespassing looks nervous. This thing looked patient. I waved my arm, a broad, aggressive gesture. "Get lost! I'm calling the sheriff." That was a lie. The landline had been dead since Tuesday, the lines likely weighed down by ice somewhere down the mountain. The figure didn't respond to the wave. He didn't respond to the threat. I stood there for maybe a full minute, the cold seeping through my Carhartt jacket. My heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I couldn't walk up there. Every instinct I had screamed, "Do not close the distance." I turned around, walked back to the cabin, and locked the door. I threw the deadbolt, then I dragged a heavy oak chair under the knob. When I peered out the window 5 minutes later, the tree line was empty. There was no sign anyone had been there. I spent the rest of the day drinking Silas's bourbon and staring at the fire. I tried to rationalize it. A hunter, a lost hiker, meth heads from over in Pikeville looking for scrap metal. But hikers move, hunters hide, meth heads twitch. That thing had been as still as the trees around it.
Friday brought a false spring of sunlight that did nothing to melt the ice, but made the snow blindingly bright. It was noon. The cabin felt claustrophobic, smelling of my own nervous sweat and the stale ash. I needed fresh air. I needed to convince myself I wasn't a prisoner. I went out the back door this time, intending to shake out the dust rugs from the bedroom. The back of the cabin faced a steep incline cut into the hill. There was a woodshed back there, a leaning structure filled with seasoned oak and a rusted chopping block. I stepped onto the back porch, the rugs draped over my arm. I took a deep breath of the crisp air, trying to steady my nerves. Snap. The sound was distinct, the crack of a dry branch stepping under weight. It came from right behind the firewood stack, less than 20 feet away. I froze. The rugs dropped from my arm. The woodpile was about chest high, a chaotic wall of logs. Rising from behind it, slowly, smoothly, was the figure. He was closer this time, much closer. I saw the coat clearly now. It was old, filthy, the fabric pilled and worn thin. The jeans were soaked through to the knees, dark with meltwater. But it was the posture that made my stomach drop. He wasn't peering over the woodpile. He was standing fully upright, his torso exposed, staring directly at the back porch. I could see the face, or I could see a face. It was pale, the color of uncooked dough. The features were generic, that's the only word. Brown hair, cut short, no beard, no glasses. It was the face of a man you would see in a crowd and forget 3 seconds later. But the expression was wrong. It was a blank slate. No anger, no curiosity, no cold-induced grimace, just a flat, dead stare. He was looking right at me, and he wasn't breathing. At 20 feet, in freezing air, I should have seen plumes of vapor from his mouth or nose. I was puffing out white clouds like a steam engine. He was emitting nothing. "What do you want?" I whispered. My voice failed me. The figure tilted his head, just a fraction of an inch to the left, a bird-like, twitchy movement. Then he took a step, not around the woodpile, but into it. His thigh hit the logs, and he didn't stop. He just pressed against the wood, the bark biting into his jeans, as if he intended to walk through the solid object to get to me. I scrambled backward, fumbling for the door handle. I practically fell inside, slamming the door and twisting the lock. I backed away into the kitchen, grabbing the longest butcher knife from the block. I crept to the window, keeping my body hidden behind the wall, and peeked out the corner of the glass. He was still there. He hadn't moved. He was pressed against the woodpile, staring at the door I had just closed. He stood there for hours. I watched him until the sun went down. I watched the shadows lengthen and stretch across the snow. I watched the temperature drop until the thermometer on the porch read 5 degrees. He never shivered. He never rubbed his arms. He never looked away. When the darkness finally swallowed him, I didn't feel relief. I felt like the cabin had just become a cage submerged in the deep ocean.
Night fell like a hammer. The darkness in the hollow is absolute. There is no ambient light from cities, no glow from neighbors, just a suffocating black void. I had moved the mattress from the bedroom into the main room, positioning it near the wood stove. I had the knife, a heavy iron poker, and Silas's old shotgun, which I had found under the bed, though I had no shells for it. It was a bluff. Time lost its meaning. I sat on the mattress, wrapped in 3 blankets, listening. At 2 a.m., the porch groaned. It wasn't the settling of the house, it was the distinct, rhythmic creak of weight shifting on old boards. Creak, pause, creak, pause. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, heavy. They started at the front steps and moved to the left, circling the wraparound porch. I tracked the sound with the barrel of the empty shotgun. My heart was beating so hard I could hear the blood rushing in my ears, a whoosh, whoosh that threatened to drown out the intruder. The footsteps stopped outside the window where I had first seen him. Silence. Then a sound that made my blood freeze. The scratching. It was gentle at first, like a branch brushing the siding, but then it became rhythmic. Scritch, scritch, scritch. Fingernails on glass, not trying to break in, just touching, letting me know he was there. I sat paralyzed, tears of pure terror stinging my eyes. "Go away," I whispered into the dark. "Please." The scratching stopped. Then the phone rang. The landline, the dead landline. It screamed into the silence, a shrill mechanical shriek that made me jump so hard I nearly dropped the gun. Ring. Don't answer it. Ring. It can't be ringing. The lines are down. Ring. I crawled toward the kitchen wall where the phone hung. It was an old beige rotary model. I reached out, my hand shaking violently, and lifted the receiver. I didn't say anything. I just held it to my ear. Static. Deep, rolling waves of static, like the sound of a roaring river. And then, underneath the static, a sound. Breathing. Wet, heavy, rattling breathing. The kind of breathing that comes from lungs filled with fluid. It was slow, laborious, and agonizingly loud. "Who is this?" I screamed. The breathing stopped. A voice came through the static. It wasn't a voice. It was a mimicry of sound stitched together to form words. It sounded like 2 stones grinding together. "Open." I slammed the receiver onto the cradle so hard I cracked the plastic casing. I ripped the cord from the wall. The silence rushed back in, louder than before. Then the porch light, the single yellow bulb I had left on outside, flickered. Once, twice. It died. Total darkness outside. And then one single soft knock on the front door. Thud. Right at eye level. I didn't sleep. I sat in the corner, the poker raised, watching the door handle. I waited for it to turn. I waited for the glass to shatter. But nothing happened. Just the wind and the weight of the thing standing on the other side of the wood. When morning finally broke, a gray and sickly dawn, I waited until the sun was fully up before I unlocked the door. I expected to see him standing there. I expected to see footprints, mud, signs of the siege. I opened the door. The snow on the porch was pristine. There were no footprints, not a single disturbance in the smooth white blanket that had fallen overnight. The windows were untouched, but high up on the door, near the top frame,
7 feet off the ground, there was a stain, a greasy gray smudge. It smelled like spoiled meat and ozone.
I was leaving. To hell with the probate. To hell with the cabin. I packed my bag in 3 minutes. I left the mess, I left the food, I grabbed my keys and the empty shotgun, holding it like a club. I stepped off the porch and started sprinting toward the trail that led up to my truck. The snow was deep, sucking at my boots, making every step a nightmare. I was gasping for air, the cold burning my lungs. I made it 50 yards, halfway to the tree line where the path began, and then I stopped. He was there. He was standing right at the entrance to the trail, blocking my exit. But he had changed. He wasn't wearing the gray coat anymore. He was wearing a faded green military jacket with a yellow patch on the shoulder. My knees buckled. That was Silas's jacket, the one he wore when he was a fire lookout in the 70s, the one hanging in the back of the closet inside the cabin. I looked at his face. The sun was brighter now, the air clearer. I could see him perfectly. He had Silas's face. It was my dead uncle. The same receding hairline, the same hook nose, the same gray stubble. But it was wrong. It was a rough draft of a human being. The eyes were too close together, impossibly close, nearly touching the bridge of the nose. They were wide, unblinking, and devoid of white sclera, just solid, wet black orbs. And the mouth was too soft. It didn't have lips. It was just a slit in the doughy skin, slightly open, revealing gums that were gray instead of pink. He didn't look like a ghost. He looked like something that had studied a photograph of Silas, but didn't understand how anatomy worked. The thing raised a hand. It was wearing Silas's ring. It took a step toward me. The movement was jerky, hydraulic, like a machine shifting gears. Us. It spoke my name. It didn't use vocal cords. The sound seemed to come from the air around it, a vibration that rattled my teeth. It smiled. The skin didn't stretch. It tore. The corners of the mouth split open, revealing too many teeth, crowded together like broken tombstones. I didn't think. I didn't scream. I broke. I turned and ran, not back to the cabin. That was a coffin now. I ran sideways, plunging into the deep, untouched woods, straight down the ravine. I scrambled over fallen logs, tearing my clothes on briars, sliding down shale embankments. I heard it behind me. It didn't run. It didn't have footsteps. I heard the sound of heavy branches snapping. I heard the whoosh of air being displaced by something massive, moving at impossible speeds. Snap, snap, snap. It was hurting me. I hit the creek bed at the bottom of the hollow, the ice shattering under my boots. I scrambled up the other side, clawing at the frozen mud. I found the old logging road that intersected the highway 5 miles down. I ran until I vomited. I ran until my legs were numb stumps. I flagged down a coal truck on Route 23 an hour later. The driver looked at me like a specter, bleeding, half frozen, wild-eyed. I never went back. I let the state take the land for back taxes. But sometimes, when it snows here in the city, and the streetlights buzz with that low electric hum, I look out my apartment window. I look at the people standing at the bus stop across the street, and sometimes I see one of them standing too still, arms too straight, coat too thin, and I wonder if it's waiting for the bus, or if it's wearing a face it found in the woods, waiting for me to come out and see how well it fits.